Back to my house farms. My name is Sarah, and today we're talking about fermenting. Do you love sourdough bread, pickles, sauerkraut, beer, wine? If you do, then you love fermented foods. Fermentation is so easy and hands down my favorite preservation method. The dictionary definition of fermentation is the chemical breakdown of a substance by yeast, bacteria, or other microorganisms, typically involving effervescent or giving off heat. There's three main types of fermentation. The first, the type we're going to be focusing on today, which is lactic acid fermentation, or lactoferment. Lactofermentation is when yeast strains or bacteria strains convert sugars into lactic acid. Usually lactofermentation requires no heat. Lactofermentation is a method used to make sauerkraut, fermented pickles, sourdough bread, as well as yogurt. Lacto stands for lactobacillus. Lactobacillus is the good bacteria found on the outside of all vegetables. It's also found within the human body. It's in our stomachs, it's in our urinary tract. Lactobacillus is a good bacteria. So the process of lactofermenting is basically letting the lactobacillus microorganisms multiply, which is the good bacteria, while keeping out bad bacteria which would cause the food to rot or spoil or mold. Lactofermentation does not normally need a starter culture. Usually it can be done with just the fruit vegetable itself in some sort of liquid, usually a brine or salt water. Exception to this rule, yogurt is a lactofermented item. However, you do need a starter culture to do that. I'm more than happy to make a video of how to make your own yogurt at home. It's very simple. You can do it in a crock pot, you can do it in an Instant Pot, you can do it in your oven, you can do it just on your stovetop. second type of fermentation is ethanol fermentation or alcohol fermentation. As the name suggests, this is the process used to create alcohols, so beers and wines. Ethanol fermentation or alcohol fermentation is the process when yeast consume the sugars in the grains, if it's beer, fruit, grapes, peaches, any sort of fruit wines, it'll consume the sugar within that fruit, which will turn that into alcohol, which turns that into alcohol and carbon dioxide molecules, which causes the carbonation within beer and some wines. The third type of fermentation is called acidic fermentation. This fermentation is the hardest to explain. Basically, what acidic fermentation is letting an ethanol or alcohol fermentation go one step further to turn into a vinegar. Examples of acidic fermentations are things like apple cider vinegar, white wine vinegar, red wine vinegar, regular white vinegar, as well as kombucha. There are a few basic things that you need to keep in mind when fermenting. Like I said, the process is quite simple. These things are key to your success. The first is going to be sanitization. Make sure your jars are clean, your lids are clean, your kitchen utensils are clean, and the most important kitchen utensil, your hands, are clean when fermenting. You don't want to add in any excess bad bacteria while you're trying to preserve the good bacteria. The second thing you need to keep in mind is your containers. In lacto-fermented and ethanol or alcohol fermented items, you want to control the amount of air that is able to be exposed to your ferment. The way you control the air exposure to your ferment is a couple ways. You can buy some contraptions that'll help you, which I'll show you. There's some things that you have around your house that you can use, which will work just as well, and you don't have to spend any money. So let's start with the contraptions that you can buy. All of these things are relatively inexpensive, and if you're fermenting a lot, I would recommend you to buy them because they're a great investment and they're going to last you year after year after year. The first and most common item that'll help you control the air exposure to your ferment is called an airlock. They come in different shapes and sizes. Some of them are glass, this one's plastic. And an airlock is a 4-piece system. So you'll have your main airlock. You will fill with a sanitary liquid. So this can be distilled water with some star sand in it, which is a sanitizing agent. You can fill it with alcohol. The second piece is this little stopper, which will go over the top, which just prevents your ferment from coming up and out into your airlock. It may happen, and if it does, don't worry about it. It's very normal. Then you'll have a top piece, which will go on. And then you have a lid. The lid can come in many different shapes and sizes. It can be a small rubber stopper to go on top of a wine bottle. It can be many things. This one fits a wide mouth mason jar, which is what I prefer to ferment in with things like vegetables, pickles, etc. So the airlock will sit in the little stopper, and this will go on top of your jar and prevent air from coming into your ferment. Another option is a crock. This is a 1 gallon crock. I have sauerkraut fermenting in here right now. So the way this works is sauerkraut is in the bottom. There's a weight on top. It is filled with distilled water, which not all people do, that's just the way I do it. And then there's a lid. There's a moat around this lid, which you fill with water, which creates an airlock. Air cannot get in because the water is stopping it. So this is another contraption you can buy. When you're lacto-fermenting, it's important to have whatever you're lacto-fermenting be submerged in the brine that you're using. So you can buy weights. This weight will sit inside the top of the mason jar and push down whatever you're fermenting to keep it submerged in the liquid. If you don't want to buy a weight, what you can do is take a sandwich baggie, fill it with brine, and just stick it on top of the jar, which will weigh down your ingredients. You can also use the fruits or vegetables themselves. Within my sauerkraut, what I have is in non-shredded large cabbage leaf over top of all the shredded pieces. I have weights on top of it, but if you didn't have the weights, you could just use the large cabbage leaves to weigh down your ingredients. You can do the same thing with cucumbers if you're making fermented pickles. Use a large cucumber, kind of wedge it in the top so it'll hold down all the rest. And it'll be wedged in the jar so that cucumber itself will be submerged. There's many different ways to start fermenting, and you really don't need to buy fancy equipment to start. Some people, they don't want to buy airlocks, so what they'll do is they'll buy a balloon, put it over the lip of whatever jar they're using, and just put a pinprick in it. This will allow any gases to escape. Another thing to keep in mind is your ferment will release carbon dioxide. Therefore, it can build up pressure. Airlocks will allow the pressure to escape. If you're just using a jar, you need to be mindful to do what they call burping your jar. So that just means opening up your jar for a second, letting the gas escape, closing it up loosely. If you seal the jar up while the fermentation process is still going, your jar will build up so much pressure that it will explode. My husband will tell you about the great strawberry vinegar explosion of 2020. I had made strawberry vinegar and I thought the process was done fermenting, so I decanted them into a flip-top bottle. Time went by and I decided I wanted to use my strawberry vinegar. I couldn't get the bottle open, so I asked my husband to help me. He helped me all right, and when he finally got the bottle to release, it had built up so much pressure that I kid you not, it covered my entire kitchen, ceiling to floor, windows, everything. I spent an entire night scrubbing strawberry vinegar off my kitchen, and I clean my kitchen quite often, top to bottom. To this day, over a year later, I am still finding remnants of that strawberry vinegar. So you might end up with a mess on your hands, but more importantly, it's dangerous. The amount of pressure that can build up while fermenting is enough to cause serious injury to you if the lid comes off, hits you in the face, anything. It's powerful. So please if you're not using an airlock, you need to be mindful to burp your containers. Right now, this bottle has kombucha in it. Kombucha will create carbonation. So I have this bottle just with the lid set on top so that way it can release gases, and I will not close it until it's completely done. The third thing to be mindful of while fermenting is your storage while fermenting. The environment in which you ferment has a huge impact on the overall result and flavor of your ferment. Typically, microbes work well in room temperature, which is anything from 75 to 85 degrees. If it's too cool in the space where you're fermenting, mold will grow. The phrase is cold equals mold. If it's too hot in the area you're fermenting, that heat can kill off the microbes and your ferment will stall out completely and won't keep going, and the bad bacteria will take over. There are some instances where you need to control the temperature which you're fermenting at, and in those cases it's usually for wine or beer. The fourth thing is time. Ferments take time, and the amount of time each ferment takes is different. Certain vegetables ferment a lot faster, certain vegetables take a little more time. And it's also based on your taste. So for example, sauerkraut. I like to ferment my sauerkraut anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks. Some people let theirs go a lot longer because they like that more sour taste. The longer you allow something to ferment, the more tangy and sour the taste will become. So once your ferment is done, the last thing you need to be mindful of is storage of your ferment. In the case of lacto fermentation, what you want to do is store your ferment in a cool, dark place. I store mine in the refrigerator because what you have to keep in mind about lacto fermentation is that it'll keep fermenting until it's completely broken down. When you put it in a cool, dark place, aka the refrigerator, the fermentation will slow down so much that you can store things in your refrigerator from anywhere from 4 to 6 months. I'll tell you that this is sauerkraut that I made in October of last year. It's been in my refrigerator since then, and it is just fine. Please use your judgment, like I said with canning. If it smells funny, looks funny, don't eat it, throw it away. It's not worth the risk. Like I said, fermentation is one of my favorite preservation techniques. When I'm talking about the garden, I'm mostly talking about lacto fermentation. So making my sauerkraut, pickles. There's so many recipes for ferments. Fermented salsa, fermented hot sauce. I've done them all, I love them all. If you like fermented foods, I highly encourage you to lacto ferment your own produce. In the case of ethanol or alcohol fermentation, I've done that as well. You can refer back to my dandelion wine video. That dandelion wine has now been bottled and is aging, ready to enjoy in about a year. My husband makes his own beer, which is also a fermentation process. Although much more involved, it's still fermentation. I've also made my own apple cider vinegar, which is one of the easiest things to do I will show you in just a few short weeks because apples are starting to come in. Again, fermentation. The benefits of fermentation are endless. It's easy to do. It's a great way to preserve your harvest. It's great for you. Lacto-fermented foods have great rich probiotics that are great for your gut health and great for your overall body. Case of alcohol, to each their own. Alcohol is not great for you, but if it's something you enjoy, I highly recommend that you try out a simple wine recipe. Yes, it takes some time and a little technique, but it's nothing that is impossible. I'll leave some links down below to the items that I've purchased to help me with fermenting. Like I said, you don't need to purchase these things, but if fermentation is something you're going to do regularly, spend a little money, invest in yourself. It'll make the process easier. I hope you enjoyed this crash course on fermenting. I'll be sharing some ferment recipes coming up. As I said, fermentation is one of my favorite ways to preserve, so I ferment a lot. So if it's something you'd like to try, stay tuned. Otherwise, thank you for spending some time with me this afternoon. Until next time.